Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen.
Amen.
Please be seated. Today's epistle lesson from the old prophet Isaiah. Paul actually quotes from that good old prophet. See, Paul was one of the early interpreters of the Old Testament, putting the Old Testament in the light of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And this passage illustrates how he used the Hebrew scriptures that were familiar to him to encourage the Roman Christians whom he had never met, presumably both Jews and Gentiles, trying to get them to live as harmoniously as possible in a world that was a little bit skewed at that particular time. Like Isaiah and many other the prophets and psalmists, Paul, you see, had this very hopeful vision of a world that would be based on unity and peace and justice, especially between the Jews and the Gentiles. He fervently believed that this could be achieved through the faith in Jesus Christ, and he was convinced that the Messiah had to be Jewish. And he had dedicated the whole of his ministry to show that Gentiles too were included in God's purpose and plan of salvation. Hope, thought Paul, is what was vital. In fact, it was critical. It's critical for us. And if we're going to survive in our everyday lives, it's very important that we have hope. Paul understands this to the point that he wrote these words: for everything that was written in the past was written to teach us, so that through endurance and the encouragement of the Scriptures, we may have hope. A few story about a couple of good old boys named Larry and Elmer who were out hunting one day and got lost. Trying to assure his friend, Larry said, "Don't worry, all we have to do is shoot in the air 3 times, stay where we are, and somebody will find us." Well, they shot in the air 3 times, but no one came. And after a while, they tried again, still no response. When they decided to try once more, Elmer said, "I hope it works this time, because we're down to our last 3 arrows." You see, Larry and Elmer were putting their hope in the advice of others, even though they didn't understand that the particular advice didn't apply to shooting arrows. But Paul, however, was very comfortable in using the Old Testament predictions. Paul was a believer that the advice given in those ancient messages would eventually bear fruit, and of course, he was right. To fully understand the thrust of his message, we have to look very carefully at those Old Testament words. When Isaiah wrote about this root of Jesse, he simply meant that the old Israel, the Israel that had been beaten down, abused, defeated time and time again, that torn nation one day would be replaced by something much more glorious. The church. And it will be done by one that he identified as a shoot from the stump of Jesse. Jesse was the father of David, the king of Israel. Of course, we know that Joseph and Mary were in Bethlehem at the birth of Jesus because Joseph was of the house and lineage of David. Now, while Paul speaks very eloquently in his epistle to the Romans about hope in today's lesson, this reading reminds us that the prospect of hope is tempered with the reality that goes on in this world in which he was living and in the world in which we live today. You know, those readings are somewhat opposite, quite actually. We have judgment and condemnation on one hand, and on the other hand, we have the promise of some kind of peace and tranquility. One says that when things are looking up, the world is really going to hell in a handbasket, and you better have your house in order. The other says that even when we're destined for slavery and defeat, ultimately God will save us, bringing supreme peace to the world. The voice of doom on one hand, the prospect of a wonderful peace on the other. So where do we find ourselves on this second Sunday of Advent in the year 2019? In his poem, The Peril of Hope, Robert Frost wrote this. He said, "It is right in there betwixt and between the orchard bare and the orchard green, when the boughs are right in a flowery burst of pink and white, then we fear the worst." How do we maintain our hope in a world that, in my opinion, is getting very close to some of the things that the gospel lesson spoke about today? Well, first of all, we have to believe in hope, the hope that's offered to us by Jesus Christ. Hope is mentioned throughout the New Testament. In Matthew 12:21, in his name the Gentiles will have hope. 1 Peter, born again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. 1 Timothy, we have fixed our hope on the living God who is the Savior of all men. Christian hope, my friends, is not just wishful thinking or dreaming. It's not yearning for something or longing for something. It's not just positive thinking of some kind of psychological phenomenon. Christian hope is a confident expectation in the spiritual reality of Jesus Christ. Secondly, we have to maintain our hope, especially in perilous times. Now, we're entering a season where we've been through already a part of it with all of the things with Black Fridays and everything else. Millions of people now are running around in pandemonium, going to parties, buying gifts, decorating their houses, taking time off work, whatever. For Christmas, however, is a happy reminder of the hope that we have because of that little infant Jesus Christ. And we mustn't forget that with all of the other things that goes on. That's the whole purpose behind Advent. You know, in the old church, Christmas started on Christmas Day. I love watching A Christmas Carol. Probably my favorite movie. I've watched the old-timey version, black and white, from the 30s. My favorite one is George C. Scott as Scrooge. The message there is important. It's a wonderful message, and that message takes place on Christmas Day. That song, The 12 Days of Christmas, was written beginning on Christmas. Even if you're slogging your way through all the disappointments of life, we still have the hope of that Christ child to believe in. And it's not a childish fable. It's not a false hope. It's not a fairy tale that will have a happy ending. When Christ rose from the dead, that ended the argument, period. Our hope in him is solid and it's real. I read an interesting story that happened at the funeral of the former Soviet leader, Leonid Brezhnev. His wife carried out a rather silent but timely protest. She stood motionless by Brezhnev's coffin until seconds before it was closed. And then just as the soldiers touched the lid of his casket, she performed an act of great courage and hope. She reached over and made the sign of the cross on his head. Now that was a gesture that certainly must rank as one of the most profound acts of civil disobedience ever committed. There in that citadel of secular atheistic power. The wife of the man who had run it all hoped that her husband was wrong. She hoped that there was another life, and that life was being best represented by Jesus Christ and the cross. That same Jesus might have mercy on her husband for all of the atrocities he had committed. G.K. Chesterton, the great Orthodox thinker, was an Anglican and later became a Roman Catholic, wrote, "Hope means hoping when things are hopeless, or it has no virtue at all. As long as matters are really hopeful, hope is merely a platitude or a kind of flattery. It is only when everything is hopeless that hope begins to be strengthened." And finally, I think hope sees the present with all of its imperfections and yet still believes in a real future. There's a wonderful story about a family in which there were two sons, very close in age. One was a pessimist who always found something to complain about. The other boy was an avowed optimist that managed to find good in just about everything. One year, the parents decided just to test their dispositions, and so they gave them different presents just to see what their reaction would be. They gave the pessimistic brother a box full of truly amazing gifts, and the optimistic brother, they gave him just a large box, and it was filled with aluminum foil and filled with horse manure. The parents let them open the presents and waited for about 15 minutes to see how the boys would react before they told them that they had other presents. The pessimist quickly busied himself sorting through his goodies, and they went to the optimistic brother, and he's sitting in a room all by himself, holding that box and throwing it up in the air, shaking that manure around, and he's got a big grin on his face, and his parents come up and say, "Son, what are you smiling about?" And he says, "With all this manure, there's got to be a pony around somewhere." Hope has a rather disorganized sense of blessing that seems to work itself out slowly and sometimes with step-ups and step-backs, but always defining itself with purpose. Hope is the light of the world that gives us eyes to see blessings in the midst of the ordinary. It's the wisp of something to come that grants us determination in the midst of despair, courage in the midst of a crisis, power in the midst of great peril. It is the hope that Advent represents. It is found in the root of Jesse, of which Isaiah spoke. It is found in the poor and helpless infant of Bethlehem, the eternal Word of God. And yes, as the Scriptures predict, the heavens and the earth are passing away at this very moment. The world of God does not pass away, as today's college expresses. In that